bad art can be such a valuable thing. It can show us what not to do, or make us better appreciate good art even more. But when a piece of bad fiction truly becomes something more than just another poorly conceived book or movie or game, is when you can feel a driving, creative, passionate force behind every aspect of its design. With that in mind, today I want to talk about the worst game ever made, and what makes it so special. Today, I want to talk about Y2K, a postmodern RPG.
1, 2, 3.
Y2K, or Yiik as we're going to be calling it throughout this video because of the Roman numerals in the title, and also because it's way funnier, is a true gem of a bad video game. Almost every single aspect of its design is holistically bad, committing just about every poor decision you could possibly make as a game designer. It's tedious, incredibly poorly written and paced, with horrendous combat and dungeon design, and one of the most unlikable protagonists and cast of characters ever put into an RPG. And yet, I find myself completely obsessed with this game. A game of this level of quality is extremely rare, especially one with any amount of passion and heart behind it. And what makes it even more fascinating is how dangerously close it often comes to actually being good. While every aspect of its design is bad, yes, every single one of them contains just a few interesting ideas that scrape right along the edge of resembling something good. It's a game openly inspired and supposedly providing commentary on RPGs as a genre, but seems to take so few lessons from the things that inspired it. However, fascinatingly, almost nothing about Yiik feels half-assed. The people who made it, Axe Studios, crammed so many ideas into it and desperately wanted it to be something that it just turned out not to be. It is a deeply flawed experience, and we are going to spend a lot of time discussing and understanding these flaws, but each one comes from such an interesting and genuine place. The driving force behind Yiik is so personal and legitimate that, despite the flaws in its design, make me kinda love the game.
Where should I begin?
I think I've gotten a bit ahead of myself, so let me rewind a little bit. What the hell is Yiik? What is this game? What's it about? Well, there are already at least 3 really excellent videos out there about Yiik. I know from a lot of responses I've gotten on my Twitter that plenty of people still have no idea what the hell this game is. On paper, it's pretty easy to explain. Well, kinda. Yiik is a turn-based RPG heavily inspired by games like Persona and Earthbound, about a man named Alex, who, upon witnessing a woman being attacked and kidnapped by strange otherworldly entities, assembles a group of friends to learn more about the strange things going on in his small town, Frankton. He meets up with Michael, his childhood friend and photography enthusiast, Vela, the perpetually angry goth girl, Rory, the self-proclaimed scene kid with a dead sister, even though that was a 2000s thing and this game is set in 1999, but whatever, and Claudio and Chandra, a brother and sister searching for their own lost sibling. The plot gradually becomes more and more expansive as the game continues, introducing the ideas of multiple realities, the ability to travel between them, entities known as soul survivors who seem to be behind a lot of the supernatural happenings, and a reality-destroying comet that approaches all realities at the turn of the millennium on Y2K. This all sounds fairly basic and moderately Earthbound reminiscent, which is something I'll be saying a couple more times in this video. But let me just clarify, that Yiik is some of the most bizarre and insane actual storytelling I have ever seen in any work of fiction, not just in video games. The thing Yiik is most famous, or infamous for, is probably Alex himself. People have endlessly called out Alex for being one of the most unlikable and annoying protagonists of all time, and, on the surface, this doesn't need to be a bad thing. Plenty of very good stories have protagonists who are either unlikable or who have done very bad things in the past, and the story uses them to reinforce its themes. But Yiik makes the, bold decision to place almost its entire focus on Alex and his thoughts. The game's infamous monologues often stretch on for minutes on end, where Alex recites his overly verbose thoughts directly to the camera, often about things the player either already knows or definitely does not need to know. Alex is not just the main character of the story, the entire experience centers around him, through constant self-reflection that he and the player barely learn anything from. Alex is almost a caricature of an annoying, pretentious college student, and the way the game conveys this is by forcing the player to listen to paragraph after paragraph of his pseudo-intellectual ramblings. Yiik has never heard of less is more, and every dialogue scene stretches on and on without any understanding of why people even listen to dialogue in video games. These monologues are so infamous and offer so little that, after the game's release, the developers added an option to severely reduce their length. The actual storytelling often grinds to a halt, so characters can ramble on about their one defining character trait, or long, overly drawn-out explanations of concepts the player either already knows or is barely learning anything about due to the game's writing style. The game shotguns so many different concepts directly into your skull, while initially explaining none of them, only to later do so in the least engaging way possible. Long, drawn-out monologues. Video games that are dialogue-heavy are not necessarily bad, but the problem here is, after you get past the sheer number of words getting thrown at you, nobody ever actually says anything. The dialogue is written like there's a thesaurus open directly next to the keyboard, and nobody ever actually says anything clear and concise enough to fully understand. This ties directly into the game's other most noticeable story flaw, how goddamn confusing understanding any of its concepts is.
Fucked up, man. You fucked up!
At first, Yiik starts out like a pretty focused story. The game is divided into 6 chapters, and although it classifies the last one as merely an epilogue, that's where the real conclusion to the game lies. Usually in a classic, small-town weirdos find out something much darker is going on kind of story, you want to gradually introduce mysterious concepts with little explanation and slowly reveal their secrets. Season 1 of Stranger Things and basically the entirety of Gravity Falls are both excellent examples of how to pull off a story like this. And Yiik does kind of start this way. It has a decent introduction to how Alex is going to act in the game by making the first line of the whole thing a monologue directed right at the player, and then immediately has him be a huge dick to his mom. After the grocery list his mom gave him is stolen by a cat with a mustache, he follows it to an old abandoned building and the game's supernatural elements start right away. He starts fighting monsters and experiencing bizarre and genuinely kinda cool visuals before he meets Sammy, a girl who has been living in this building for most of her life. After a fairly insufferable first meeting, Sammy is taken away by mysterious entities known as soul survivors, and Alex runs home to reflect on the insanity of his day and process the bizarre things he's seen. I'm not gonna lie, this is a pretty decent introduction to this story. It's plagued by a lot of Yiik's overarching issues, sure, but it clearly establishes our protagonist and the flaws he has to work on, sets up a character who clearly means a lot to him, gives him motivation to get her back and understand what's happening, and throws many interesting, unexplained concepts at the player that will presumably be explained in the long term, setting up mysteries to be unraveled over the course of the game. And then none of that actually happens. At least, not in any actually interesting ways. Yiik has a severe problem with its pacing and structure. It fails to understand the principles and purpose of setup and payoff, leaving many of its ideas muddled and confusing. Alex's character flaws and general jackassery will be set up as a major plot point and then barely discussed for 3 entire chapters until suddenly returning at the very end as if it was the main focus all along. Concepts like the soul space and the soul survivors are interesting mysteries that are set up early that the players will want to understand themselves, only to be offhandedly explained by Vela 2 chapters later with zero sense of mystery in another drawn-out dialogue scene with nothing to keep them interested. Concepts like Proto-Alex, Proto-Michael, and several other non-Proto things will come wildly out of nowhere with no setup at all, while an entire fifth of the game is spent setting up the mystical Ultima LP Legend record, which never pays off in any meaningful way. Yiik has zero idea how to budget out its runtime, wildly tossing in new ideas at every opportunity, then either leaving them unexplained and confusing, or over-explained and boring. And a lot of these ideas are interesting on paper, or have implications for the game's story and characters that could be really interesting if established and paid off correctly, but are left without the development to be truly impactful. I don't want to make any assumptions, but it seems like this came about from overambition and the unwillingness to cut or trim down the runtime. In the initial scripting process, I'm sure a lot of these ideas made much more sense than they do now, but they were likely intended to be more intertwined and fleshed out, and as the script ballooned to massive size and the game likely ran up against its budget, they couldn't be as developed as they were originally intended to be. Scenes that may have originally been planned as experiencing events firsthand or with more elaborate visuals were cut back to just be monologues or stilted dialogue sequences, robbing them of any mystery or tension. And I know this is the case because a few scenes have been changed after release to be more visually grandiose, with more elaborate camera angles and more direct story progression, namely the iconic Golden Alpaca scene, which was transformed from two dialogue portraits yelling at each other in an empty room to an elaborate scene that properly sets up twists about a few characters, without outright spoiling them, and progresses Rory's character far more naturally than the original version of the scene did. Despite the many on-paper good ideas that the writers of Yiik had, upon being translated to an actual game, many of them failed to have the development and appropriate time spent on them to make any of them truly feel central or important to the narrative. The plot itself is left aimless and confusing because of this, rarely focusing on any one thing to create any narrative throughline. You can feel so many good ideas desperately trying to surface in Yiik, but they're getting crushed by the weight of the game's own writing. A common thing that a lot of indie RPGs try to do is to put their own twist on classic turn-based combat, in order to both appear fresh and new, while also reminiscent of classics from the past. In Yiik, instead of just pressing a button and letting the game attack on its own, each attack has its own unique timed button input that must be done in order to complete it correctly. In addition, whenever a party member is attacked, another button input must be done in order to block or avoid damage altogether. On the surface, this sounds like a really good concept. Games like Paper Mario and the more recent Bug Fables do this kind of thing very well, with quick, unintrusive inputs that make your skills matter more in combat and keep you engaged if you want to be successful. However, Yiik develops upon this idea by turning simple and quick tests of timing into full-on, drawn-out minigames. Every fight, even the random encounters on the overworld map, take significantly longer than they need to, as you're forced to play entire rounds of WarioWare before you can so much as swing your weapon. If the length of these minigames were somewhat proportional to their damage and priority, then this would be less of a big deal. However, skills like Claudio's Bushido take a full 15 seconds to complete, and often have damage output less than attacks that are over in 3. In addition, there are only 3 variations of the defense minigame with almost no difference in timing, so you're forced to repeat the same action with 0 variation hundreds of times over the course of the game. Making RPG combat more interactive and focused on the player's actual skill level is totally encouraged and can often make combat way more interesting while maintaining an indie budget, but the gigantic length of Yiik's battles and how every fight requires you to use the exact same strategy means this gimmick gets old extremely quickly. This isn't even getting into the biggest and most apparent flaw in Yiik's combat system, which is the boss fights. Yiik only has a handful of major boss encounters in its runtime, typically towards the end of the 6 chapters, and they are extremely strange in their design. The first major boss, the robot roommate Wilhelm, goes down so easily that most people who have played the game probably don't even remember he exists. After that comes the iconic Golden Alpaca fight, then the battle against the Mallrats, then the encounter with Yuzu, and then the climactic showdowns against the Alex Comet, and then the final boss. There are 2 more major problems that overshadow all of Yiik's combat, but are especially present here: a complete lack of strategy and forced losses. Every enemy in Yiik, regardless of their presentation, health, damage, and theme, all require you to deal with them in the exact same way. Spam your strongest attack using time energy, and then successfully complete the dodging minigame. Most party members only have about 2 or 3 moves, and most of the time you're only going to be using their beatdown skills, as high damage is really the only thing that matters. Yiik teases the intelligent use of status effects with skills like Alex's sleep skill or Michael's poison skill, but the benefits offered by these are so minuscule and take up a turn you could have just spent attacking. Every fight plays out in the exact same way, and this extends to the boss fights. Despite their higher damaging moves and more climactic music, all bosses are is just another character model for you to execute the exact same strategy on over and over again until it dies. Except bosses have way more health, meaning you can find yourself doing the exact same thing for almost 20 minutes until they finally fall over. Boss fights that may seem cool for the first 5 minutes quickly lose any sense of weight they have when you realize you'll just be repeating the same minigame for the next 15. The only boss that really changes up gameplay, Yuzu, does so in such an insane way that I am confident his fight was barely playtested. Due to story reasons, you only have 2 party members when you fight Yuzu, and his basic attack that he uses every turn has a 100% stun chance. So this effectively means that you only have 1 turn per round while he infinitely stun locks the other one of your characters, and if one of you is ever KO'd, you're stuck in an infinite stun loop you can never escape from. It's an attempt to use status effects in an interesting and creative way, but doesn't understand anything about why status effects are even used in RPGs. doesn't make you play smart, doesn't make you develop a strategy, it just makes you repeat the same thing even more. The second major problem is an overuse of fights that you're supposed to lose. Making any fight in a video game a mandatory loss is already a very bold decision that can make the player very frustrated. Yiik has 4 separate mandatory losses you are forced to suffer over its runtime, and several of these are climactic boss fights that you can't even win. There are more forced losses in this game than actual legitimate winnable boss fights. In addition to just being extremely frustrating, this makes the player wonder whether combat is even worth attempting or winning whenever they see a new enemy. Upon entering a new boss, a player's first reaction should not be, I wonder if I'm even supposed to beat this guy. Forced losses can and have been used in some games to establish the player's power level, or deliver an emotional moment, or to make the player feel helpless. But this trick loses all of its power when it's repeated over and over again, and just loops back to being frustrating. Much like its story, Yiik's combat is born out of so many good ideas. Interactivity, interesting enemy designs, and the use of forced loss can all make RPGs a better and more memorable experience for the player, but the core mechanics are developed nowhere near enough to make them feel worthwhile. Once again, these good ideas are washed away by amateur design decisions and tedious time wasting that doesn't make the player even want to engage with any of the actual gameplay. Alex Eggleston is a character who believes the entire world centers around him, and that's partially because it does. The developers of Yiik have been extremely open in interviews both before and after the game's release that Alex was never meant to be the most likable character in the world.
I wanted to make a game about a guy who's like a piece of shit, unlikable character who by the end of the game has to transform.
Players were supposed to find him annoying or creepy or unlikable, and then watch as he redeems his flaws and develops over the course of the game and emerges from its events a changed man. His journey was supposed to show a man realizing his flaws, learning from them, and then overcoming them to become a better person. The main problem with that narrative, however, is that never actually happens. The Alex the player meets in the first second of the game is functionally the same as the Alex the player hears from in its last. Sure, he's a bit more overtly shitty towards the start, and some people do call him out for it, but his flawed core traits never change, and if they do, it feels rushed and unearned. It's genuinely hard to talk about Alex's flawed personality and not bring up the bizarrely iconic "nobody cares about your dead sister" scene. This scene, occurring towards the end of the game's second chapter, follows a moment where Rory, a new addition to the party, finally accepts his younger sister's death and feels like a genuine emotional moment for the guy. However, not content with not being the center of attention for a moment, Alex chimes in and reprimands him for feeling emotional, saying,
Dude, cool it with that! No one cares about your sister right now. We almost just died ourselves.
Alex, what is wrong with you?
It's really harsh, and this may be a controversial opinion, but I don't actually think this scene is that bad when judged purely on its own merits. Well, shitty, yeah, what Alex says here isn't 100% unreasonable. They did almost just die thanks to something Rory lied to put them through. It's not a likable thing for a character to say, but it clearly isn't intended to be. The party's reaction is clearly shocked and upset, and Alex gets called out pretty much immediately for being so shitty to a kid he just met. This feels more like the start of an arc of self-reflection, where Alex looks back on his actions and sees why he reacted that way and lashed out at the first people who have shown him any real kindness since he got back from college. Sure, the way the dialogue is delivered makes it kinda funny, but this scene in its relatively early place in the story promises that the game will capitalize on having an unlikable protagonist and actually make him grow over time and learn from his mistakes. And the scenes right after support this. Visions of alternate Alexes flash through his mind, discussing his less than ideal character traits and forcing him to reflect on how he's affected the people in his life. Hell, the next chapter is literally called Reluctant Apology Tour. The next day, his party even seems pretty pissed with him, with Vela straight up refusing to come with him until he makes things right with Rory, and Alex's inner monologue bounces back and forth between wanting to apologize and doubling down on his criticism of Rory's lie. The stage is set for an introspective and thematically relevant examination of how Alex views the people in his life, even just some kid he met the other day, and his place in their lives as well. And then their actual first conversation since the incident is 80% taken up by a dumb sight gag about a mannequin leg. Like, I'm being serious here. The first thing Rory and Alex say to each other after the scene this entire chapter supposedly centers around is joking about how attractive a severed mannequin leg is. It's not even that the joke is bad or unfunny. There are dumb gags like this in loads of games, and they work just fine there. But the sheer lack of regard for where and when this scene is being placed in the emotional narrative completely robs it of any humor and lessens the reactions of everybody else in the scene. Literally any tension or thematic relevance the scene might have had is completely thrown out the window because the writers had an idea for a semi-decent joke and just wedged it in wherever with zero regard for context. Even when the conversation moves back to what it's actually supposed to be about, it's over in one dialogue option and then immediately moves on towards trying to find a magical record from another universe. If you're wondering why I'm emphasizing this one little moment so much, it's because it's just so painfully emblematic of the main problem with Alex's character and Yiik's themes overall. The writing pays lip service to the ideas of character growth and character development, that this unlikable guy is going to overcome his negative traits and respect other people, but the writing is constantly walking over itself by introducing new concepts, having random interjections from other characters, or inserting out-of-place comedy into scenes that desperately don't need it. In this scene, just like the rest of the game, all actual development for Alex is resolved in only a few lines before the story can resume its overcomplicated narrative or focus on something the player simply doesn't care about. So when the game actually has a good idea that the player wants to focus on, they barely ever can due to the onslaught of new ideas that the writer thinks are just so clever. This makes the game's insistence that Alex has grown kind of patronizing to the player, as the game fails to ever really show his development outside of him just hanging out with people more. Alex is the same snobby hipster at the end of the game that he was at the start, only this time he has more people around him to berate. Alex is constantly monologuing about the things he's learned and the ways he's changed, but the player never really gets to see any of that, and is therefore completely detached from any of the themes the game tries to throw at them. There are multiple, full scenes where Alex explains his character development directly to the camera, only to, a chapter later, go back to being dismissive and annoying to his friends again. This is why Alex is such a hated character. It's not that people can't handle playing as flawed or morally compromised protagonists, but that the game is so insistent that he's becoming something more than that when he simply isn't. Two of my favorite games of all time follow characters who do something far worse than Alex ever does, but then those games' entire narratives focus around that action and how it affected the people in their lives. It works in those games because the entire experience is centered around the flaws of the protagonist in a way that makes their arc more believable and satisfying once they start to take accountability for what they've done. Yiik pretends it's a story about one man's improvement and self-betterment, but in reality that's just another idea the developers thought sounded cool on paper and then never fully fleshed out. The one time when the game tries to severely call out Alex's actions is also, unfortunately, one of the worst written things I have ever seen in a video game. I mentioned earlier that the player has dialogue options when it comes to how they talk to Rory in the days after the "don't care about your dead sister" scene, and while they change only a few lines in the moment, they have a larger impact in the long run. If the player chooses to be constantly dismissive to Rory and never apologize for the way they spoke to him, then upon returning from Essentia's mine dungeon in Chapter 4, Rory will have taken his own life while Alex was away. I do want to say that this is extremely heavy and deals with a topic this game probably isn't prepared to talk about, and if you know anything about Yiik, you know that isn't the only topic it shouldn't really be addressing. However, it does, at the very least, introduce meaningful consequences for the way Alex can behave. It shows that he does have influence over the lives of his friends and those around him, and you would imagine this would send his rude and detached demeanor crashing into the cold hard reality that he now has to realize he's in. The scene where Alex is informed of what happened actually carries a good bit of emotional weight, although that's mostly due to Vela's voice actress's fantastic and unsettlingly believable performance. Once again, this seems like the moment where Alex's whole personality is called into question, the theme this game is supposedly all about. And yet, once Alex quickly overcomes the shock of the news, his monologue is entirely about the way he feels and the way others are going to see him now. He seems to have extremely little concern that one of his friends is now dead, and instead whines about how incredibly important he is. This entire scene that could be heartbreaking is instead filtered through Alex's own ego, and comes off as easily the shittiest he is in the entire game. He monologues for 5 entire minutes and barely acknowledges his own role in Rory's death or how he could change going forward, waxing philosophic about the nature of grief and finding balance, and shit that has nothing to do with his actual character. And the worst part about all of this, outside of this 5-minute scene, with the exception of a one-sided conversation with Rory's ghost much later on, the consequences of this scene are never again brought up for the entire rest of the game's runtime. No characters ever call Alex out for how his actions directly led to one of their friends being dead. Alex never uses what happened to Rory and his own part in it as a catalyst for self-improvement. All that changes is when the group gathers in Alex's bedroom, there's a spot on the floor left ominously empty that Rory was supposed to sit in. This scene is supposed to be the moment where Alex's persona comes crashing down when he finally realizes there's more to this world than just himself and his own selfish desires. And yet, all that changes is that a useless party member is no longer an option to use in combat. The conversation with Rory's ghost is honestly even more insulting, with Rory claiming that Alex should not feel guilty as he played no direct part in his death, which is objectively untrue due to the changing outcomes. His reappearance instills the exact opposite of character development in Alex, telling him that he's fine, flaws and all, and that he shouldn't be worried about the dead teenager that he's responsible for. Everything in Yiik's universe revolves around Alex, and, while claiming he needs to change in some vague, nebulous way, seems hardwired to reinforcing every bad decision he makes, and ensuring that he never changes in any way that matters. And when I said the world revolves around Alex, I'm not even speaking in a metaphorical sense at all. This is going to get into some pretty heavy endgame spoilers, so if you don't want to know anything about the endings, skip to this timecode. Now, without getting too bogged down in specifics, because the game's plot kinda goes off the rails towards the end, every reality in the multiverse contains an Alex. It doesn't always have to look like him, but it retains his basic traits and personality flaws. For reasons a bit too complicated to get into with a video like this, the Alex of every universe will eventually end up destroying their reality or leaving or dying in order to save it. Alex's character flaws are directly brought into question here towards the end, as those flaws are supposedly what causes the realities to be destroyed by a comet unsubtly adorned with Alex's face. The main issue brought about by these developments in the plot is that they directly confirm the way Alex views himself and the world. He is, quite literally, the most important person in the world. And not even just his world. Every world that exists or ever will exist lives or dies based solely on his actions. Even at the end of the game, Alex is now justified by the narrative in barely giving a shit about anybody else. Rory's death doesn't matter in the cosmic scale that Alex matters in. All of reality itself is controlled by Alex, as it's also revealed the entity behind the destruction of realities is simply another Alex from another timeline. The 4 characters involved in the final scene are literally all Alexes from different realities, with nobody else even mattering or being mentioned at this point. The whole game is supposedly about Alex overcoming his self-centeredness, but he is literally correct in believing only he matters. Also, apologies if that plot synopsis sounds a bit like nonsense. I promise I'm explaining it the best way I possibly can. But if Alex somehow brought his friends into the final scene with him and finally listened to what they had to say and took their advice on the fate of the universe, then that would show any kind of growth for his character. But the only person he takes advice from in this scene is just another Alex, another facet of his own personality and self-importance. Even this has the potential to be an opportunity to look at Alex's flaws head-on, exaggerated in the alternate universe versions of himself, but the flaws the game centers in on in its final moments are simply not the ones the game itself is about. The player faces 4 evil Alexes in the final dungeon, dubbed Fat Alex, Pretentious Alex, Shady Alex, and Tella Alex. These are representative of some of his flaws, sure, but they're all very surface-level things that the game never spent much time on. Tella Alex is representative of Alex's consumer nature, desperately wanting to consume more products and media. Shady Alex represents his sexual desires, and Fat Alex is sloth and laziness. These are all fine flaws to call out, but the game never addresses any of these things or even really showcases them in its entire runtime up until this moment. These are flaws the player is barely even aware of, and are far from the chief concerns people have with his character. The only one that comes close to criticizing an actual flaw of the character is Pretentious Alex, and even then he feels more like the developer is giving a nudge and wink to the audience about their own overly drawn-out writing style. This could easily have been a final showcase of Alex's character development, demonstrating how he's come to rely on his friends in order to overcome the worst aspects of himself. But instead, you're just left wondering what the game's even trying to go for. Is it about Alex's flaws? Is it about him being self-centered? Because the game proves him correct. The ending is left so thematically confused by this, just like the rest of the game, as it pretends it's about self-improvement and development, while once again failing to show any of that development in a way that feels relevant or makes the player care. Alex is a character born from a good idea. Taking a shitty person with flaws the player may dislike and having him gradually break away those flaws and become a better person that the player themselves wants to engage with is a good, compelling hook to a story. But the game, with all of its ideas that it throws out, feels almost afraid to acknowledge or follow through on this kind of narrative, and it leaves Alex and overall the themes of the game feeling half-baked and never emotionally resonant. Unlike a lot of games, Yiik wears its intentions pretty directly on its sleeve. From the game's cover art to its Steam page to its title screen, the game makes absolutely sure that you understand that it's a work of postmodern art. Now, in terms of video games, what does that word even mean? Some define postmodernism as a kind of art that is innately distrustful or dismissive of classic ideas of what art is supposed to be, and other times it's just seen as any art released after the modern era of that medium. For the most part, we can mostly rule out that second definition for Yiik, seeing as it being specifically marketed as a postmodern game implies that not every other game falls into that same category. So we're left with the idea that Yiik is purposefully abandoning the conventions and tropes of RPGs in order to do something new and comment on the state of that genre. So, does Yiik actually do this? Kinda? Yiik is absolutely loaded with references and allusions to the things that inspired it, mainly classic RPGs such as Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger, and many anime series. Regardless of how much sense that makes in universe, Michael describes Chrono Trigger as a game from his childhood despite it releasing only 4 years before the events of the game, Yiik clearly has a lot of respect and love for RPGs as a genre. Earthbound in particular is referenced all over the place in Yiik, and while the quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPG moniker gets thrown around a lot of these kinds of games, I definitely feel it's applicable in this instance. Lots of the jokes the random townspeople tell feel like they were ripped straight out of Earthbound, just without Shigesato Itoi's perfect comedic timing and succinctness to their writing. Even little things, like how you get money and items directly out of the trash can, is pulled straight from Earthbound. In addition, towards the end of the game, it adopts a time-sensitive calendar system that is almost identical to the ones used in the Persona series, although lacking the variety of activities and choices that make the time mechanics work so well in those games. Even on the overworld map and loading screens, party members resemble old-school Dragon Quest sprites. And I think it's important to say that these are all fine things to pull from. When making an indie game, especially one that's supposed to comment on a genre and its conventions, pulling ideas or mechanics from famous and iconic games that will service your idea is perfectly welcome. However, Yiik's idea of genre commentary is, well, inconsistent. It's clearly not some kind of takedown of RPGs, as it has a lot of reverence for them, but it rarely comments on their tropes in a way that feels like it's actually saying anything. The intention seems to be for characters to act in a more realistic way to strange occurrences and paranormal happenings than they do in other RPGs, but this only happens sometimes. Alex and Michael absolutely lose their shit and start screaming like I imagine most of us would upon seeing their first Soul Survivor, but wandering just 10 feet outside of town can result in random encounters against giant rats and ninja turtles that nobody seems to pay any mind to. Seemingly normal people are able to swing records, hula hoops, cameras, and guitars like they're swords and axes, and this is once again never commented on. And this is all perfectly fine if the whole game had this unserious attitude towards combat. The Mother series specifically features party members using bottle rockets, frying pans, gigantic staples, and broken sticks as deadly weapons, but those games are set in an obviously heightened version of reality, while Yiik attempts its best to stay grounded in some form of character realism. The extent of Yiik's genre commentary seems to just stop at "this would be kinda crazy if it happened to real people," without challenging any of the deeper aspects of the medium. Another actually postmodern RPG, Undertale, actually uses its rejection of genre tropes to completely change its tone and gameplay, and asks the player to re-examine how they view beings in an inherently less powerful position than they are. Yiik certainly tries to take steps in that direction, but instead you just keep wondering, what is so postmodern about this? There's an aspect of postmodern writing that I think far too many indie devs seem to find themselves trapped in, and that's the idea of meta-narrative. Breaking the fourth wall is so common in indie games at this point that it's lost a lot of what made it surprising and special, and it's often more satisfying to see a popular indie game go its entire runtime without resorting to any fourth wall shenanigans. Let me clarify that fourth wall focused narratives in games can be done exceptionally, but they need actual purpose and development across the majority of a game's length in order to be done properly without just seeming like a cheap and easy tool for shock value. I actually really enjoyed the vast majority of last year's Inscription, but man would it have been more satisfying without any of the fourth wall stuff it pulls towards the end. All of this is prefaced to saying that Yiik delves deep through the fourth wall in its final chapters in ways that I both like and dislike. As mentioned previously, every reality in Yiik's universe contains an Alex, but also a version of each member of the rest of the party. So in addition to each reality having an Alex, it will also have a Rory, a Michael, a Vela, and so on. At the very beginning of the game, Yiik gives you, the player, a questionnaire that asks you to input your name, as well as the names of several of your real-life friends, based on personality prompts the game gives to you. And you can probably already guess how these are going to end up getting used. In the game's final act low point, where Alex has lost all hope and his reality has been destroyed by the Alex meteor, he reaches out to one last surviving reality. Yours. The real world that you, the player, live in. The big final act twist is that you are the Alex of your reality, and the Alex in the game is calling upon you for help. If you agree, then your version of the party comes along with you, represented by new versions of the characters bearing the names of your real-life friends who aid you in the lead up to the final battle. Now, honestly, I kinda love this. It's an attempt to tie the game's themes directly into your real life, into your experiences as a person. You, the player, may be living with aspects of your personality that you may find less than ideal. It makes you re-examine how you viewed Alex this whole time, and possibly even reflect on how you personally treat others. But, together with your friends who have been at your side the whole time, you can overcome those negative traits in the forms of the evil Alexes, and make the same journey of self-discovery that Alex did. The very ending of the game even has Alex wish the player good luck, as if imparting the knowledge and self-improvement that he's gone through onto the player. This is how the game attempts to be postmodern. It uses the tropes of video games and RPGs to tie in with its own themes and reflect on your personal life. To some people, this may genuinely be an emotionally powerful, self-reflective moment. However, the game's sudden involvement of the fourth wall does lead to a couple caveats in that moment's quality. For one, there is zero hint of any other fourth wall meta-narrative throughout the entire rest of the game, so players who remember inputting the names at the beginning are basically just expecting this kind of thing to happen as the game nears its end. Secondly, this is really assuming a lot about the person holding the controller. If the player doesn't have the same kind of self-doubts that Alex does, or finds the game's insistence that they're similar kind of disingenuous, then this moment loses all of its weight, and at worst, can even seem kinda patronizing. I wrote this purposefully unlikable character, so you must be unlikable too, is an understandably tough pill to swallow for some people. The questions the game asks at the beginning are also a bit too vague to get an accurate read on your friends. Most egregious is the question the game asks to determine who your universe's Rory is, simply asking, who is the opposite of you, which can be different for every kind of person. There's also the fact that, as covered a bit too extensively in the last section, Alex doesn't really undergo enough character growth to parallel a real-life journey of self-discovery. A couple people have called Alex shitty and he's monologued a lot about how much he's learned, but equating that to a person's real, actual struggle with parts of their personality they dislike is a pretty bold move. And lastly, if you weren't taking this game seriously at the very beginning and just inputted funny names for these prompts, this scene completely loses its emotional weight, but absolutely skyrockets in comedic potential.
So we're gonna save the world, huh? Serious? Man, I've always wanted to do that.
And yeah, any game where you can input characters' names can have the dramatic tension ruined by someone inputting a goofy name. But Yiik asks you 9 questions at the beginning, making it much easier for the player to get bored and just input whatever, as opposed to most games which tend to only ask you 1 or 2. However, even despite all of that, I still admire what the developers tried to do here. This is an actual, almost successful attempt to say something about how we live our lives and see other people, and expresses a seemingly genuine desire for people to improve themselves and live their best lives. It's the only time the game actually feels like it's utilizing being postmodern, in a way that captures both the strengths and some of the weaknesses of other games' attempts at meta-narrative. It's the closest this game gets to actually saying something with its story, although it definitely isn't the only genuinely good or interesting thing the game does in its runtime. So, for a video supposedly about why I kinda love this game, this has been pretty negative so far, right? And don't get me wrong, that title isn't just clickbait. I genuinely both love this game and think it's the worst game ever made. That second part is just a pretty bold thing to say, so I think it's just important to establish all of the many, many faults in basically every aspect before diving into what makes me appreciate it so much. Because while a lot of my enjoyment of Yiik is admittedly ironic and stems from the game's failures, plus another aspect of its design that we'll talk about pretty exclusively towards the end, there is some genuine good to be found here. Specifically, I want to start with the titular Y2K, an event that occurs towards the end of the game's 5th chapter. At this point in the story, multiple realities have started to collide with each other, and the rules that govern how this universe works have started to fall apart. Different versions of the party seem to shift in and out of existence, and the visuals take on a genuinely cool, otherworldly aesthetic. When Alex first leaves his house and the entire world seems to be drawn with crayon, it genuinely feels alien and like things are going wrong in a way that isn't explicitly explained to the player. Sure, Essentia's monologue literally immediately after robs a lot of the mystery and surreal vibes from the scene, but things are still weird enough to be interesting. The visuals when you get to Times Square are also genuinely really impressive, especially for an indie budget, and I'd easily call this one of my favorite scenes in the game just because of them. It really does feel like a surreal apocalypse, made even stranger by how the rest of your party seems to refuse to acknowledge that anything wrong is even happening, especially after an entire game's worth of freaking out over the supernatural. The game's flat character writing actually even works to its advantage here, purposefully portraying the characters as one-dimensional caricatures of themselves, as if these are the core traits of these characters that are supposed to be elaborated on through the alternate reality versions of themselves. Overall, I actually think the game's visuals are pretty great. Most of the character sprites used in dialogue are actually illustrated pretty well, and mostly accurately convey the emotions they're supposed to represent, except for Michael, who is mysteriously cursed with having only 2 dialogue sprites for the entire game. A lot of the overworld 3D models also look pretty good. The character models are perfectly fine, but I think the art especially shines in some of the surreal locations the party visits, with the visuals often conveying the atmosphere far better than the dialogue can. The visuals also convey the 90s setting better than anything else in the game, feeling retro without sacrificing visual clarity in what you're supposed to be looking at. And as the dungeons get more creative and surreal, I think the retro 3D aesthetics convey that vibe pretty damn well, while not requiring a ton of extra budget to realize. This might run the risk of being another controversial opinion, but I also think the voice acting is pretty decent throughout most of the game. The game gets a lot of flack for characters screaming their lines or becoming extremely emotional during scenes where it feels inappropriate, but I think that more comes down to poor direction rather than being the actors' faults. Specifically, Vela and Claudio's voice actors kinda steal the show whenever they talk to the others. They're the only two you ever really buy as genuine people because of this, and they have a ton of actually fun line deliveries. Even when the script for their scenes is bad, you can really tell they're trying to salvage this material and come out with something good. Claudio's rant about shoujo anime is pretty annoying just because of how it's written, but goddammit, you can tell the voice actor is trying to make it sound as convincing and charming as he possibly can.
The amazing blend of funk, jazz, and Japanese pop blows my mind every single time.
I'm even gonna give some real credit to Alex's voice actor here, because he tries so hard to carry this game's script on his back. Sure, not all of his line deliveries land, and some are pretty meme-worthy, but others come across as surprisingly natural for a character who's supposed to be kind of unlikable. I don't think the best voice actor in the world could deliver some of the lines in this script with 100% sincerity, but the guy goes really hard on his deliveries when he needs to.
We could live alone in this island forever. You and me. What do you say, pal?
I also just think it's really impressive that, for a game with this much dialogue, the vast majority of it is voiced. A lot of indie games don't go that extra mile, and Yiik really doubles down here. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the music. Yiik has a surprisingly large selection of songs, and they're pretty all over the place in terms of quality. A lot of the battle themes sound kind of like songs from the Lisa games, just without understanding what makes those songs work. and can often kind of come off as meandering and even a bit unpleasant because of it. However, there are some notable exceptions to this. Alex's theme can come off as a bit annoying at first, but I think it genuinely sums up the character in a way that a good character theme should. The kind of clueless and sad instrumentation at the beginning feels pretty spot on for a character intended to be pretentious, and the off-tune whistling to a more coherent chorus summarizes Alex's inherent patheticness and inability to appreciate the finer things he has in life. I genuinely think this piece of music summarizes Alex's character better than multiple full-length monologues. There are also, kind of hilariously, 2 songs provided by Bowen and Toby Fox, who respectively would compose and had composed the far better received indie RPGs Omori and Undertale. The work they bring to the table here is pretty reminiscent to the styles they utilize in those games, and Toby's Into the Mind specifically feels like a precursor to a lot of the music he'd go on to make in Deltarune Chapter 2. And then there's the 2 endgame lyrical songs, Puzzle Pieces and Little Eyes. While I can't exactly call these songs amazing, I've listened to both of them an embarrassing amount of times at this point, so they're clearly doing something right. Puzzle Pieces is clearly going for an endgame emotional final boss kind of song, kinda like Rivers in the Desert from Persona 5. And while the song's actual audio quality is shockingly poor, I think it mostly achieves what it's trying to do.
I can't give you what you wanna know till I know. Where's the piece of this puzzle? I'm begging, please. Where's the answer? The one needs the bone to keep us safe above the ground. I'll risk my life.
The middle section is honestly kinda great, and the parts that are out of tune or offbeat honestly feel like 90s punk music in a way that I wish more of the soundtrack actually attempted to be. Little Eyes is similar, contributing heavily to the atmosphere during the Y2K segment and actually having lyrics that fit the overarching narrative and themes of Alex's character. And then we get to my absolute favorite scene in the game. Throughout Alex's journey, he has been accompanied by a creature called Panda who talks to him while he's alone. Panda helps Alex organize his thoughts in the morning or at night, and helps him process his emotions after several stressful scenes. However, after Alex's reality is destroyed and he's left alone floating through the space between worlds, he and Alex have one final conversation. And I'm just gonna let this scene play out in its entirety.
And, I'm so lost. Where do we go? What do we do here? I'm terrified. I miss my friends, my family. What the hell am I gonna do out here all alone?
Alex, I don't have any answers for you. I'm sorry.
What do you mean you don't have answers? You always have something to say.
Alex,
How am I supposed to know what to do? I'm only a stuffed panda.
Hey, go come back! I don't care if you're a toy! I need you!
I now need to bring up my own personal experience with this game. I have played Yiik 2 times now. The first time I played by myself in March 2019, about a month after it was initially released, and the second time I played it was about a month ago. When I first played it, I was interested, but I wasn't enthralled by it. It was a perfect storm of bad and I thought it was funny, but thought little else of it. Upon playing it again 3 years later, however, that's when I decided I had to make this video. Well, I technically didn't play it, but I got a similar experience. This time I was watching one of my friends, who had extremely little knowledge about the game, play it for the first time, while watching alongside about 10 other people. And if I'm going to be entirely honest here, that was one of the best experiences I have ever had with a video game. This is gonna sound like such an exaggeration, especially after all the time I've spent saying how terrible the game is, but believe me, I mean every ounce of it. Yiik is such a fascinating game to pick apart and to truly attempt to understand, especially when you've got people along for the ride with you. I genuinely do not think I can over-exaggerate how frequently and how hard we were laughing at every bizarre line of dialogue, or unwinnable boss fight, or insane new plot development. Even any clips I can show here can't even really encapsulate how much of a genuine joy riffing on this game was. I've talked a lot about the game's negatives, and I still firmly believe they're all there, but these negatives all transform into memorable and hilarious positives if you go in with the right mindset and the right group of people. There are so many scenes in Yiik that are simply unlike anything else in video games as a medium. Scenes that, on paper, could come across as incredibly cringy or uncomfortable somehow become the funniest things you've ever seen, such as when the option to try and kiss Rory unceremoniously appears in a conversation at the diner after literally zero build-up to it.
Kiss him.
Yes.
Kiss him. Kiss him.
Oh my god.
Kiss him.
Oh
Don't
my
ruin
god.
those. Kiss him.
Kiss him, kiss him,
Okay,
kiss him.
everybody
Watch
kiss
this,
him.
kiss him.
No!
Oh,
Kiss him. Kiss him.
oh my god.
Yes.
No.
This is where one of Yiik's biggest problems, the previously mentioned misunderstanding of setup and payoff, becomes one of its strongest highlights, because you literally never know what the game's going to throw at you next. It is a non-stop, no-holds-barred thrill ride of the craziest shit you have ever seen. That panda scene I showed you earlier, it's got a genuinely good voice performance and is a pretty interesting conclusion to a character, but the second that panda starts floating away into the vastness of space, and Alex's voice actor screams his lungs out, I started laughing harder than I have in months. I cannot overstate how every single flaw Yiik has somehow loops back around to being fascinating and hilarious when viewed this way. All of Alex's shittiness towards the other characters turns it into this absurdist sitcom starring the worst man of all time. The truly terrible story pacing is constantly keeping you on your toes, and throwing new plot developments out of literally nowhere to keep you laughing. Even the terrible combat became increasingly hilarious as moves hit for absurd amounts of damage and button inputs became increasingly and comically cryptic. It is extremely difficult for video games to be so bad it's good. Movies that are bad sometimes become funny due to their low production value, failed attempts at action, bizarre pacing, or awful performances. But when control is placed in the hands of the player, these things usually come off as just annoying rather than amusing. It is extremely, extremely rare that a game as bad as Yiik on so many levels comes even close to being a genuinely amusing experience. Lots of games that sometimes get the so bad it's good label are often just good games that have a cheesier tone. I've heard this said about some of the earlier Resident Evil games, and even stuff like Metal Gear Rising. Games rarely, if ever, achieve this level of reverse quality, but this is why Yiik is so special. It is bad. It is very bad. But every single bad decision is so interesting or comes so close to actually saying something that it keeps you glued to the screen. You need to know what insane shit is going to be behind that next corner. It comes so close to being genuinely good on so many occasions, and sometimes, rarely, even is. But every time it's blocked by confusing priorities or the game's bizarre writing and themes. At every step, you can tell something is wrong, something is incorrect, but it's so fascinating and so funny in its badness that it sticks with you long after you finished it. And that is because Yiik has something that so many other bad games seem to lack.
Now my body is filled with that overwhelming feeling that I'm about to do the right thing.
Here is a list of what I consider some of the worst games I've ever played. It's not comprehensive or anything, I haven't played every game ever made, but among these, Yiik sticks out as an experience. When I think of the vast majority of these games, the word that comes to my mind is soulless. A game with no passion behind it. A game that didn't need to be made. A game with no new ideas to bring to the table. A game you can tell that nobody really wanted to work on. And, shockingly, absolutely zero of those things apply to Yiik. Every single aspect of Yiik's design was created by two dudes with a strong vision for what they wanted their game to be. They truly believed in what they were making, and you can see this even outside of the game, and their sheer passion they demonstrate in loads of interviews leading up to its release. These guys really thought they were making the next Undertale. They thought they were making the next big thing to dominate the indie scene. And not in a cynical way like a lot of those YouTuber bait horror games. There was actual driving passion behind this game's creation. None of this is a quick cash-in. None of this is lacking heart. There are so many little moments in Yiik that just come across as so personal and significant to the developers that even if those moments are bad, I just can't bring myself to hate them. One constant point of mockery towards Yiik is the ongoing mentions of Two Brothers. Two Brothers was the previous game by the developers, themselves a pair of brothers, and it was a critical and financial failure. Just like Yiik, they clearly poured their heart and soul into it, only for it to go nowhere, and I can totally understand being crushed by that. Throughout Yiik, Two Brothers is mentioned a bunch of times. Alex describes it as being a classic game he used to play as a kid. A statue of the game's protagonist exists right in the center of Alex's hometown, and if you lose to the final boss, a character from Two Brothers appears to give you a pep talk. Alex's shirt is even adorned with its logo for the entire runtime. This can certainly come across as self-indulgent, but they're clearly coming from a sincere place. They wouldn't just reference a game that nobody's played for no reason. The developers cared about that project, just like they cared about Yiik, and I think we can all understand wanting to honor something you worked so hard on. This same passion shines through every bad decision in the game. The combat's bad, but you can absolutely understand why the developers would want to try and make RPG combat more skill-based and interactive. The pacing is bad, but it's partially because the developers had so many ideas for what they wanted the story to be. And that story is undoubtedly unique, with no other game I've ever played even attempting to tackle some of the subjects and ideas that Yiik goes for. Alex's character and the themes are muddled and confusing, but you can absolutely tell that the developers wanted to say something profound about self-improvement and the flaws we all see in ourselves. The fourth wall breaks aren't that well thought out or developed, but they desperately try and resonate with the player's real-life experiences. And even some of the game's worst moments, like Rory's death scene, come from a simply misguided attempt to discuss darker, real-world issues. And this is why, despite all of its many problems, I still love Y2K. It's awful, but it's the kind of awful you can only get from pure, unrestrained creativity. Most AAA games are never allowed to be this interestingly bad, because they have a baseline of mediocre quality that they're not allowed to dip below, but are often not allowed to reach above. Indie games, and independent creations in general, allow people with ideas to express themselves without any creative limitations, and that allows things like Yiik to even exist. This game's quality is simply the byproduct of creativity running wild, and as deeply flawed as the game is, I wouldn't have it any other way. Games like Yiik deserve to be allowed to exist. They can teach other designers lessons, help us understand what other games did well, or simply be appreciated as works of unintended comedic brilliance that occasionally get close to being something more. Yiik isn't noteworthy despite its flaws, it's noteworthy because of them. Every bad choice, every terrible scene or frustrating mechanic came about from a flawed but deeply passionate driving force. Would Yiik be better if it was genuinely better made? I certainly wouldn't be making this video if it were, and no game would have filled the role it takes up in the way I view video games. If it was only marginally better, it would, by now, have fallen into obscurity, simply another indie RPG in an industry overflowing with them. Its misguided but deeply creative flaws are what make it special. The unbridled creativity that indie games are allowed to explore make them my favorite kind of art, and Yiik is genuinely a good example of why. The negative reviews against Yiik have been pretty unanimous. From IGN to YouTube critics, everybody has taken easy shots at this game and the people who made it. Hell, this video might just be another one to add to that pile. And after all this, after 3 years of constant ridicule, you'd expect Axe Studios to simply write the game off, to declare it a failure before moving on to bigger and better things. You would expect Yiik to be another two brothers. However, in those 3 years since the game's release, they haven't done this. In fact, they've done much the opposite. The 1.25 update for the game released in January of 2021, almost exactly 2 years after the game's initial release. This update fixed some of the problems with combat and altered a few of the more maligned cutscenes to bring them closer to the developer's original intent, as well as adding a few accessibility options. It was certainly appreciated, but then they announced the 1.5 update.
Analog girl with digital buttons. Analog girl in a plastic shell.
A complete overhaul of the combat. Tons of new writing and a further fleshed out story. Tons of new music tracks. Visuals that look genuinely amazing and further accentuate the surreal atmosphere of the game. And a late 2022 release date. Even after everything that's been said about their game, the developers are still trying to make it the best it can be. They refuse to leave a game they cared so much for behind, and are moving past the overwhelming criticism in one last attempt to realize their ideas. That undeniable heart and passion that lies at the center of Y2K, that makes it so interesting to play and so fascinating to talk about, is still pushing the developers to keep improving. And I can only wish them the best. Yiik is a bad video game. Very bad. Easily one of the worst of all time. But a game that is so bad in such consistently interesting ways is an invaluable thing to have in this medium. A consequence of the open-endedness of indie development that still shines through with all the passion that makes indie games worthwhile. I'm not even sure whether I want 1.5 to be genuinely better or to somehow be worse, but I will absolutely be there to play it. Because, even with all of its flaws, I just can't help but love it. Thank you all so much for watching. I put a lot of work into this, and I'm very happy you guys stuck around till the end. I'm definitely going to try and get some more videos out over the summer, so please subscribe if you want to see those. I want to real quick thank a few people who helped make this video happen. I want to first thank my good friend Zach, who made the amazing thumbnail art for this video. He makes great art, and his Twitter will be linked in the description. I also want to thank Mossbag, who helped me with some technical problems during the video, and I'll link his channel in the description as well. Lastly, I want to thank all of my friends I played the game with this last month. Without them, this video would certainly not exist. So, huge shoutouts to Lexi, Doodle, Sammy, Hora, Davey, Irene, Scrap, Fletcher, Ari, and Goose. And make sure to subscribe and follow my Twitter, which I'll link in the description if you want updates on the next video. Thank you all, and I'll see you next time.